Good evening, everyone. It's hard to follow that, and what a well-deserved award. Ambassador McCain, just really impressed by everything you've done, and frankly, your whole family. I only had a chance to meet Senator McCain several times, once with Admiral Mullen, a couple times with Secretary Mattis. And as you know, he roughed some people up. But I'll tell you, there was universal respect for what he did for the military, for this country, and what you have done. So thank you very much. My job right now is different than to continue to talk about the McCains, although I could do that. My job is to introduce a friend of mine, General Dag Anderson. I had to work on the pronunciation of Dag because I've taken to calling him Dag, and for several years he's put up with it. But today he put his foot down and said, please, my real name is Dag. So it just gives you a sense of who he is. He's comes from a family of public servants. His father was a police officer. His mother was a teacher. Two of his brothers served in the military, as did older generations. Born and raised in Michigan, and has a sort of middle-of-the-country, working-class approach to this country and what he does. He went to Washington University and received a ROTC scholarship to be an Air Force officer, which he successfully did, and joined the Air Force and had learned to fly in high school, but continued that. He's now served, I think, over 30 years. He'll correct me. And there's a little bit of dispute. His Air Force biography says he flies 16 kind of aircrafts. He said, no, that's bullshit. I only fly 8. So just to give you a sense. Joint assignments, I think 7 or 8 joint assignments around the world. But when I got to know him when he was working at the Joint Staff, he was basically in charge of thinking about the future of warfare for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley. And much like Senator McCain, working for Mark Milley was very combative most days. But Dag was thoughtful and humble and disruptive. Plus, he had the courage to tell Milley and everyone else above him what he thought the future of warfare should be. And as you see now at the Department of Defense, he won't claim credit, but they are starting to institute things like the autonomous command, autonomous warfare. And it was partly, I think, because Dag was there seeding those ideas, challenging the system, and delivering. And that's what he has done, I think, throughout his career. That's what he's doing now as the commander of U.S. Africa Command, based in Stuttgart, Germany. But his commitment to this country and what it represents and what the McCain family has done for it, when I told him there might be an opportunity to come to this event, he was really excited, not only to talk about Africa, which he will talk about here, but just to honor the service of the McCain family. So thank you very much. General Anderson, Dag.
Honored to be here. I'm Mosheh, Oinounou, by the way. I am a journalist who actually had the incredible luck to cover the McCain presidential campaign for Fox News, and so spent a year on that campaign bus. And to do him justice, this conversation will go 4 hours and continue on a bus. So I hope you guys are all prepared for that. We literally used to question the senator until we ran out of questions, and then we would have him call our parents on their birthdays, because he's like, what else can we do here on the bus right now? But I know that's to Steve Dupree later, recounting memories of the senator. But we have a lot of incredible insight to gain from you tonight, General. An opportunity to hear about a part of the world that does not get nearly enough coverage, admittedly as a member of the media. I want to begin with the big picture. You've been in charge of AFRICOM for about 8 months now. You did spend some time previously overseeing special operations there as well. You've been spending time with African leaders from Algeria to Libya to Somalia to Ethiopia. You've described Africa as the new epicenter of global terrorism. When many policymakers still think about terrorism, we still default to the Middle East. What has changed in Africa over the last few years? And let us in on what the fight is like right now on the continent.
Sure, happy, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. I got to meet Cindy McCain earlier today, Jack and Jimmy. I really appreciate that. So for me, first of all, people have been saying how excited they are to hear me speak, and I'm not quite sure why. When you see what Cindy McCain's done, what Senator McCain has done, for me, not only is it a privilege, but I'm a bit in awe to actually be invited to speak here. So thank you for that, and I very much appreciate it. I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be sitting in a room like this on stage where people actually wanted to hear what I had to say. So really do appreciate that. A couple things I would correct for Sally there. I appreciate it. She's a dear friend here, but I've flown 16 aircraft. 8 of them I've been qualified in, and I've flown 3 operationally in combat. That doesn't mean much to anybody but a pilot, but those are the why it gets nuanced. The last part, I will say, Dag and Dag. My grandmother was Icelandic, and she called me Dagvin and so that's what I grew up with. My grandmother on my mother's side was Irish and Welsh, and she could not ever say that. She called me Dag. So I have grown up with both of them, and I don't have any problem with people calling me Dag or Dag, because that is how I have grown up. But the correct pronunciation would be Dag, and it's a shortened version. And then the last thing I will say, that she didn't acknowledge that, yes, I come from a family of service, but the true North Star for me was my grandmother, who was a nurse. She worked until she was 82 years old, and at one point she came home and said, you know, I'm not sure if someone collapsed that I'd be able to lift them up and put them on the table to examine them. And we're like, Grandma, you missed that decades ago. But she finally retired. She passed away at 89, but she was the glue of our family. She was the matriarch that ran things. My grandfather worked many different jobs from the Great Depression on, and she was the North Star. She was the second oldest of 18, she probably took 15 of those other ones in at some point, helped them get jobs at Ford Motor Company in Southeast Michigan before they launched themselves on their way. So for me, service is just an expectation. It was never something, what would you do? Of course you're going to serve in some way, and I just chose the military as that path. So, sorry, that was not what you asked.
We're used to that, interviewing. You got to run for office.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Ran with it.
Yeah, so Sally warned me, right, because I talk too much. My answers go too long, so I'll try to be concise here. But, hey, so first of all, I'm just really excited to be here. That anybody wants to listen to someone talk about Africa for more than 10 minutes is a thrill for me, because it is critically important. It is going to change the future, right? A third of the world's working age population by 2050 will be African, and their average age or their median age will be 19 and a half years, right? Half of the births are likely to be in Africa in 20 years. This is going to have an effect on our global economy, and it's absolutely critical that we start understanding what that is, because we ignore it at our own peril. One of the things that I think that you highlighted here that I think is critical is we have had some success putting pressure on terrorist organizations, global terrorist organizations in the Middle East, but that hasn't defeated them. It's caused them to move. And that epicenter of global terrorism is in Africa. ISIS leadership, all of their leadership right now is African, whether it's in Somali, Nigerian, Malian, Niger. They are African. The Al-Qaeda's economic engine is in Africa right now, in the Sahel, where they extract millions of dollars in extortion, kidnap for ransom, and illicit activity. They have learned. They're smart, right? They are the learning organization. And they've learned to be quiet, to not talk about what they do, because they realize what happens when they become too bold, when they advertise. We come and put them back in their place, whether it was Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Both of them are learning organizations, both of them have evolved, and both of them have migrated to Africa. Some would even say some of the roots of these organizations were in Africa to begin with. But I want to clarify very quickly here that this is not to disparage Africa, because the people of Africa, for the most part, do not want these terrorists there. The Western Africans have a long, long history of a very moderate and open form of Islam. They were some of the greatest scholars in history, whether it came out of Timbuktu or Senegal or other places. And so this is anathema to them. But one of the key issues here that we need to understand is that with this growing youth population, with the challenges that many of these nations face, some of the poorest nations on the earth with the highest birth rates, is that they have to find a way for their future. And if they don't, then the terrorists will. Two of the top employers on the continent right now are ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Sahel, in the 5 years I've been out of this game here, from when I was at Special Operations Command Africa today, have more than tripled in size. And so they are employing and they are bringing folks in. And I guess the last thing, I'll let you go, Mosheh, sorry. Most of these folks aren't joining for the ideology. Mm-hmm. They want to have a family, maybe a motorcycle, and they want to have an income. And then the ideology comes, and then they become indoctrinated. But this is why when we look at this, security is much more nuanced. I'm going to bring it from the military perspective, but I have to have an understanding of the drivers, and I have to have an understanding of what these countries are facing, so when we engage with them, we can be most effective.
So let's talk, you mentioned both Al-Qaeda and ISIS right now. Defining the threat, both their ambitions versus their capabilities right now. As you look at Al-Qaeda on the continent and ISIS on the continent, where are their epicenters? What is the nature of their capabilities? And again, the ambition versus the capability.
Yeah, so let me start with Al-Qaeda. There is no doubt that that organization still has the will and intent to attack the United States and our interests. That has not gone away. As far as what their capacity is, I actually have a hard time being able to explain exactly what that is. And just to be clear too, I'm not saying that these affiliates aren't still in the Middle East. They still have organizations there. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen still exists. There's senior leaders still in the Middle East. But they're looking to Africa more and more. And the Sahel has become that epicenter for them in particular, where they now control vast swaths of territory. They have media operations. They generate millions of dollars of income. This is where they're focusing their energy and their efforts. The problem is, once the French withdrew, 5 years ago there were over 7,000 French troops across West Africa. Today there are less than 500, none in the Sahel. One European nation remains in the Sahel, in Niamey, and it's the Italians with a very small presence. We had to withdraw from Niger just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, you've called it an intelligence black hole.
It is, and that has created this intelligence black hole that we don't have good understanding of what's happening. So for us, we still have intelligence. We still understand some of what's going on. But what I don't have, I think right now, is enough understanding to provide sufficient indications and warnings of when they tip from just intent and will to the decision to actually actualize that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the situations we've been watching very closely and was wondering, what insight you can provide this room is just how close Al-Qaeda is right now, their affiliate JNIM in Mali, to officially taking over a country. This is something that even, in Al-Qaeda history, they've never had their own country.
Yeah, so we've been watching this with, matter of fact, I almost didn't come here because of what happened last weekend, because JNIM did a series of complex attacks across Mali. It probably didn't break the news here in the United States. But it included attacks in the airport, international airport just outside Bamako. And what's chilling to me about this is JNIM, for the first time, came out and made a public statement that they were going to attack and seize Bamako. They were going to cause it to collapse. And they were putting out a public message for the civilians and the people of Bamako to not resist. That should give people some chills, because that's what ISIS did before they went into Mosul. Mosul wasn't even a national capital. And you may think Mali it's a small country. Most people can't find it on a map. If I say Bamako, they don't even know what that is. But it is a nation state. And to have a terrorist organization that now has a capital with all the trappings of a nation state, I think changes the game. It changes the threat, it gives them legitimacy, and it makes them very attractive to folks that will come from around the world. It also gives them access to the resources, and as meager as they may be for Mali, for a terrorist organization, they're pretty significant. And so this is my concern of where they were. And if just to play back here, in the fall, JNIM had controlled or had been able to interdict every road that went into Bamako and was preventing fuel from reaching Bamako, nearly to the point of riots occurring. They backed off. I'm not sure exactly why. What I would have told you 2 weeks ago is it's a matter of time before we see that. We are seeing that now. The other part that people don't realize is that they have run this play already 3 or 4 times in Mali, of where they have learned how to choke key capabilities or key resources that come into a city until the people capitulate and they can take without violence. So for me, this is very concerning right now. And I'm not trying to say the sky is falling. I'm not trying to be alarmist. What I'm saying is that we need to pay attention to it, and we need to at least dedicate sufficient resources to disrupt this. Ideally, we provide the intel or the capabilities or the resources for the partner to disrupt this, to make them more operationally independent. I don't want to go do this. I want to look at what unique capabilities, understanding intelligence, planning, expertise, training, and then in extremis, the force that America can bring, use those, only those unique things that America can bring, and enable our partners, enable those host nations to actually take care of this problem. Because it's not going to be us that's going to solve it. We've learned this lesson. But we can enable partners to be more effective. And we need to not learn the wrong lessons and just walk away or ignore the threat, because I believe it is real.
Play out the scenario, though. Should J&M be able to, run a nation state? How does that?
Well,
what is their ambition? Are they taking out neighboring states? And ultimately, something you noted is that AFRICOM of the combatant commands gets 0.1% of the DoD budget. How are we combating it, and what is the scenario here? Should they be in control of a country?
So, like I said, I have a real concern about where this could go. I don't know what their full intent is, but I seriously doubt they would stop in Bamako. They definitely have the intent to attack the West, and I think that will eventually they will develop that capability. How far they continue to go, I don't know. I know other nations in the Sahel, their capitals are quite weak as well. This could easily be playing out in Ouagadougou or Niamey. And I don't think the coastal states are immune to this either. And if you look at states like Nigeria, which is the most populous nation in Africa, the third, fourth largest economy in Africa, I'm not sure we can afford as a nation to allow instability to take hold in the coastal West African states. So I don't believe, but I don't know, right? I'm not, again, this goes back to having the understanding. I don't know when they will stop. But once you build some momentum, I'm not sure they will stop until they're halted by an external.
I want to talk about another area of focus, and remarkably, until the war in Iran started this year, I was actually stunned by this stat. The U.S. launched the most strikes on any place on Earth in Somalia last year. It's one of the most active combat zones that people don't really talk about. You got Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab in the south. You got ISIS in the north. Lay out the state of play in Somalia right now.
Yeah, so let me start with ISIS, because we didn't talk about that entirely. So the global leader of ISIS is living in a cave in the Golis Mountains in northern Somalia. He is Somali, he's a breakaway. He ended up creating the ISIS affiliate, and then eventually has become the leader. A little over a year ago, we worked very closely with the Puntland forces, which is one of the northern provinces of Somalia, to go up into the mountains. And we provided some, again, what are the capabilities that we can bring as the United States? So we did some bombing with F-18s off the carrier. We provided intelligence. We did some planning. We gave them advice as they went in there. And the key was that support allowed the Puntland forces to be more effective, to go in there, but more importantly, they have stayed. And they have stayed for over a year. The territory that ISIS controlled, they have shrunk to less than 30% of what they held before. And they've been able to restrict their logistics and their ability to communicate. What we have been able to do is continued ISR, which allows us to continue to help our partners, and then deliberate strikes to go after ISIS members that is inhibiting their ability to command and control. And so we have been able to disrupt the leadership, the very highest part of their leadership, to control and to command and control their network. So this is why we've been doing this, and this is why these strikes are important. They don't get talked about a lot. As you said, the other part of this is Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is the largest and most lucrative affiliate of Al-Qaeda. They have pledged their allegiance with Al-Qaeda. There's debate of whether or not Al-Shabaab truly wants to attack the United States, so they're just concerned with Somalia. And that could change, I don't know. But right now, what I understand is they generate more revenue than any other affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and some of that revenue goes back to Al-Qaeda leadership and goes back to Al-Qaeda that does want to conduct external operations against the United States. The other concern that I have is this growing cooperation that it appears is developing across the Gulf of Aden between the Houthis and al-Shabaab. And this is still opaque to us. We don't fully understand, but we can see things just in open source where there's cooperation and there's greater engagement, and that should also concern us. If those two organizations start to cooperate, what does that mean for one of the world's great choke points? As about $1 trillion of the world's economy tends to go through that area. 4 times the volume of the Panama Canal goes through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And so, again, what does that mean for us in the long term, not only for our economy, but for our ability to project force? As everyone thinks if there's a fight in the Pacific that we're going to launch everything from the West Coast and go across the Pacific, Djibouti is actually closer to Taiwan than Honolulu. And so there is going to have to be force flow, and there are things that are going to have to move across the Indian Ocean. But going the long way around Africa changes that calculus.
So, yeah, I mean, you're laying out very serious things that are happening in Africa right now, very serious threats. It comes at a time here at home where Americans increasingly are exhausted by it all. Yeah, you actually mentioned, I don't know if you want to go into this, your 92-year-old father, Charlie, and his reaction when you got this role.
Yeah, he was like, why?
And the conversations that you have with him.
He was like, why? Why are you going to AFRICOM? He was like, do we need someone there? Do we need an AFRICOM? And I had to explain to him what I was going to do and why I was going there. And this is actually when I took command of Special Operations Command Africa. And finally, after a couple hours and a few beers, he just finally slapped the table and said, all right, I'll believe you. And I think he only believed me because I was his son. But this is a real concern, right? How do we articulate this to Middle America?
Right, like,
so
why do I care about
understand it?
al-Shabaab? Why do
That's
I
right,
care if
why?
al-Qaeda has Mali?
Correct. Why do we care? Because we saw what happened when we ignored them before and the Twin Towers were attacked. We see what it does to global commerce. We see what it does around the world, and that allowing this type of terrorism to take root and to continue to commit atrocities against the populace, I don't think we can sit back and wait until it becomes a problem, because then it becomes an emergency. Like a pilot, we talk about this all the time. It was a joke. You don't have to know all your checklists and all your procedures, because eventually you just let the emergency proceed until it's a boldface, and you've got 3 or 4 memorized steps, and then you execute it. The problem is when you do that, you're in a critical emergency that is now life or death. I would like to get ahead of it before it becomes that. And I'm not saying that I'm not advocating a large deployment of forces to do this. I think there's ways we can do this that don't take a lot of resources, that we can enable partners to be more effective, that we can go in only when we have something unique to offer in order to disrupt this. But it's about disrupting the threat and then working with the partners to address the other issues that are the underlying causes. But that's not, so I think that's a nuance too, where people think I'm advocating for more forces. What I want to take is that 0.1% that we have and optimize their utility, optimize the effect that they have.
I want to talk about Iran. I know that's CENTCOM, not AFRICOM, but more about the lessons that you're learning from it. We were talking about force projection, talking about asymmetric threat here, where even the sinking of the majority of a country's navy, they're still able to, with some speedboats, control 20% of the global energy flow. And certainly there are a bunch of incredibly important straits in your territory, whether it's the Straits of Gibraltar, the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandab, just across there. Curious about the lessons you're gleaning from what we've seen so far play out over the last 2 months in Iran, for how the U.S. Is able, or what things do we need to work on in order to counter these asymmetric threats increasingly in that part of the world?
There's a couple things that I can talk to there. I think the first off that I would like to just say is the incredible effort that the Joint Force has made and been able to execute in relatively short time. It is pretty phenomenal. And for a career special operator whose history comes from the deserts of Iran in 1980, when we, at Desert One and Eagle Claw, when we lost aircraft, airmen, Marines, and helicopters because of an accident that happened in that same desert. To watch the rescue of Bravo, or 44 Bravo, dude 44 Bravo, and see what happened there. And I understand the aircraft were destroyed, but the fact that we were able to go back into the deserts of Iran, with a large package. But this time we had learned invaluable lessons about joint operations, that we had a secondary plan that then allowed the rescue and the exfil of that equipment. And we actually had a tertiary plan behind that, that if that wasn't able to go, we had another plan in the hopper. So we have learned and created an incredible force from that failure. And I think that's one of the strengths of the United States and our military, is that we are able to learn from our failures. We don't always like to admit them, I got it. But I come as a career pilot that the debrief is the most important part of the mission. And eventually you have to acknowledge the mistakes that you made if you ever want to get better. And I think today we need to look at some of the great things that we have learned, not only from the desert in 1980, but over the last 20, 30 years of joint operations. We have more to learn. And as Sally was saying, we are not there because we're at an inflection point in history where we're at the maturation of the digital age, and it's changing the character of war. Much like the maturation of the industrial age in the early 20th century completely changed the character of war that was played out in World War I and World War II. Another topic. The other lessons, though, to your point of the impact of asymmetric force. One, we should never underestimate the ability or the will of adversaries to absorb pain, and that they are willing to force or allow their people to suffer in order to resist. And that's something we just have to understand, that is the case, whether it's the DPRK, whether it's the history of the Soviet Union, whether it's what we're seeing in Iran today. It doesn't mean we don't act, it doesn't mean we don't do things, but we need to understand that that plays into it. Also understand that there's a resilience to that, and we're seeing this play out asymmetrically across Africa, where the propaganda that's coming out of Iran right now is catching on.
We're talking about the Lego videos.
Yeah, the Lego videos. I mean, my God. We should be the masters of that, right? The Lego videos, I'd never in my wildest dreams would have believed that that would have been what resonated across Africa, but it is. And so it goes into a whole other topic we can talk about, is the importance of engaging in that domain and being active there. But those types of things play out in our AOR. The other one that I mentioned, though, is as we see the straits there being constricted, is coming around the horn means we have to have ports that we can pull into in order to refuel, resupply, et cetera. And so making sure we have the relationships, the investments, and the access in order to be able to do that is absolutely critical. That is direct impact to national security.
Yeah, I mean, in talking about that, so we have the asymmetric issue, in the straits. We have the propaganda videos, the information warfare. You were the director of force development at the J7, looking at the future, and that the weapons that we need are not just bombs, but we've been talking about the information environment, the propaganda environment, that you can win the kinetic war, as we've seen, but lose the information war, lose the war of public opinion, lose the war of public opinion in our own country. Curious, as you spent time there looking at force development, looking at the future, what are some of the lessons you've gleaned from that experience, and now observing what you're seeing unfold there? What does the U.S. need to be doing to compete in this era?
Well, we need to embrace it. We need to acknowledge that we need to engage in that domain. Information is absolutely critical. I agree with you. That's where the actual long-term campaign could be won or lost. And so we have to be able to be willing to engage. And for some reason, I think we've been hesitant at times to talk about what America stands for, what America brings. So just listening to the president of ASU here talk just warms my heart, right? Because that's what we're all about. I won't name the university that I went to at one point, but I was told, oh, we're not an American university, we're a global institution, and we serve the citizens of the world. And my argument was, well, you're sitting on American soil and you're benefiting from American values and laws. I think you're an American university first and foremost. And I had a running argument throughout the entire year that I was there about this. So I'm actually glad to hear or see when folks embrace this, because that's part of the information campaign, talking about what it is that America brings. What is it that makes us a great nation? Yes, we've got flaws and imperfections, and we are striving to ideals that were laid out 250 years ago. But it doesn't give us a pass not to talk about that. But talking about that, I think, is what resonates around the world. And we have to be willing to embrace that and talk about it. And the last thing I can say, as we've done this, we mastered this in the Cold War. We were the masters of broadcast and information operations. And the adversaries took note. And they are using that against us, but they've now adapted to the digital age. And we have been slow to catch up. And I studied in the Czech Republic for 2 years. I had a good friend of mine. He was an air defender. I was a pilot. We had some really interesting conversations after a few beers. But what was really interesting was one night we were talking, and he said, I used to always drive my family down to the border of Austria so we could get underneath the jammers because we loved American jazz and we would listen to Voice of America. And at the risk of being arrested, they would go down there and listen to American jazz on their car radio. But what was more interesting to me is when he said, it was interesting to us because every 15 or 20 minutes you broke in and you gave a little bit of a news coverage. And he said, when we heard things we didn't hear in our country, obviously, but what was very interesting to us and gave you more credibility is you talked about some of the bad things that were happening in America that we would never talk about in Czechoslovakia. And we realized that that was probably more believable. But the reason we tuned in was for the American jazz. But and it didn't necessarily cause the capitulation or the overthrow of the communist regime, but I guarantee you it accelerated the move towards democracy in West once the wall fell. I have zero doubt about that. And so we need to embrace this and embrace the digital age and be more willing to talk about who we are as a people and what we bring. And it's okay to talk about some of the mistakes we've made in the past because that's the brilliance of the United States is we try to correct, we try to improve. We sometimes fail at it, but we try. And that's something that not every nation does. And I think it's something that people do look to us and do admire. And I think that is something we need to continue to talk about. And so a long-winded answer there to say that information operations is absolutely critical and it's a key amplifier of what we do on the continent. And if we cede that ground, we allow others to define that space, and Russia and China are more than happy to set the tone of the conversation. Because if we don't say what the message is, they will.
Yeah, I mean, and you set me up, I don't want to let you go without talking about Russia and China on the continent. You've talked about Russia viewing Africa as its purse, and I want to talk about the economic implications of Africa, rare earth minerals, et cetera. And then separately, one thing you noted to me was that the Chinese are bringing African journalists for training to China, and that is where the whole crop of African journalists are learning journalism under an authoritarian regime in China. So I want to lay out for us what Russia is up to in Africa and what China is up to in Africa, and where we are in that competition.
So the Sahel, the Sahara, West Africa, has become Putin's purse. He extracts billions of dollars of gold and uranium from there regularly. He also extracts humans to fight his war in Ukraine. And so this is something we should understand because what they thrive on, what Russia's model is to come in and promise counterterrorism, promise effects, not really make a lot of noise, but not really do anything that actually I think brings security, and then use the chaos to insulate the regime so they are compliant and dependent, and then use that to extract whatever they may need. We've seen this in the Central African Republic was the first model of it. We're seeing it play out in Mali. We're seeing it in other places. And so Russia thrives in a controlled level of chaos. China, on the other hand, does not. China wants stability, but they want stability on their terms. And so they're willing to find a regime. They're willing to pay that regime in order to gain the access. They're investing, like you said, in dozens of affiliates across the continent that then they bring in and provide free media content from Beijing. Much of it doesn't really apply to China or to Africa, but it's free and they put it in multiple languages. Like you said, in Kenya, they have sent hundreds of reporters back to Beijing for journalism training, which should be disturbing because Kenya has one of the longest traditions and histories of investigative independent journalism. They're ferocious. Is that what we want to cede the ground to let China then train them? But what are we doing? Where are we training these folks? And again, folks will say, why is a combatant commander talking about this? This is not what the military should be doing. But this has direct security implications for us because that is what changes the information environment and determines whether we have access or not, whether or not that country is amenable to our engagement or not. And so we have to pay attention to this because it all comes together. And I'm not trying to be the information guru. I'm not trying to get into this space and direct it. What I'm saying is there are security implications that we need to discuss and understand what those mean and why this is important. And I would say the same thing about economics. I'd say the same about innovation, that there are things that we can do as a combatant command that convene. And I believe today still the United States can convene other nations better than any other nation. More people trust us to come than anywhere else. Right now, I'm to have 3 major exercises. Our 3 major exercises are going on simultaneously. I've got African lion in Morocco. I know there's some Moroccan friends over here. I appreciate their J4 is here. It's our largest exercise. We have over 36 African countries that participate, a dozen European countries, and we have folks from Japan, Korea, and Brazil that participate. Who else can convene that wide variety of nations under a common cause and provide value? Obagami Express is our naval exercise in the Gulf of Guinea, and Brazil is one of the highlights of that because they were able to send a ship all the way across the Atlantic to participate in there when we didn't have the capacity because of other events. Flintlock is a key exercise, our special operations exercise. The main effort is in Cote d'Ivoire at the counterterrorism center that's there in Cote d'Ivoire. But what's really interesting to me, and I'm really excited about, is right now, today, we are doing an exercise. Part of that exercise that our special operations team put together, being led by Italy, is in Sirte, Libya. That is the first time, I think, in at least 5 decades or more that we have done any kind of exercise in Libya. I'm not talking El Dorado Canyon, but when we had Wheelus Air Force Base was probably the last time that we did an exercise in Libya, and here we are today. But the thing I want to highlight about that and the importance of that is the exercise is with 100 soldiers from the east and 100 soldiers from the west in a combined unit. Our special ops teams that are training them say they get along great. They know each other. Some of the east live in Tripoli and some of the west live in Benghazi. More importantly, that my deputy commander went down there, John Brennan, and sat with them, and at the table with him, sitting next to each other, was the Deputy Minister of Defense from Tripoli and the head of the Libyan National Army from Benghazi. They weren't seen together publicly. They both came to Sirte. They sat next to each other and they used their official titles. They recognized each other, and more importantly, they announced together that they were moving towards a unified military. This should be incredible news to everybody here because that has not been the case. And when I did some office calls on the Hill not too long ago, more than one congressman or senator asked me, "Are you sure? Have you been to Libya?" I was like, "I absolutely have been. I was in Benghazi and all the cafes were full, and there were more cranes than I could count." And I will say it is fragile. It could collapse. But now is the time to engage. Now is the time to invest. Now is the time to get there ahead of China and Russia because that is critical terrain. It's obviously key to the Europeans. It's why we're partnering with the Italians, who the Prime Minister, Meloni, has really taken the lead in trying to galvanize European energy and interest in engaging in Africa. But those are the things that with a small investment, so that investment there is 3 special operations teams. I mean, literally it's about 40, 50 people for the exercise, plus about 200 Italians, and there's a dozen other countries that are there. It's a small investment, but the impact of that, being able to have a venue, to have the leaders from both sides come together publicly, is an intangible that we should not underestimate the value of. And those are the things we're trying to look at is how can we build that, because it's not us that's going to build Libya's future, it's going to be the Libyans, but we can help facilitate that and mediate that. And we are still the trusted nation to do that.
I want to end there with, because you were talking about hard power and soft power, economically development. There's a lot of concern that the end of USAID was going to have a particular impact in Africa, a very negative impact. And so curious what you've gleaned from African leaders in light of those developments last year and the impression they have of the U.S. and the trust they have that the U.S. is going to be there.
So one, I really do appreciate what aid does bring. We've worked with them for years, and the World Food Program is a key player on the continent. It's significant to help keep people alive, right? To help them continue through tough situations. One of the things that I anticipated was some real backlash when I went and talked to these different leaders. So in the 8 months I've been in command, I've been to 14 different countries, met with all the leadership and usually the presidents or very senior ministers. The feedback has been, that's what we really want. We want access to your economy. We want to engage you with trade. We want investment. And when you look at the demographics and their rising youth population, that's one of their key security. I bet 9 out of those 14 leaders have told me one of their top 3 security concerns is the rising youth population and youth employment. And so aid doesn't necessarily provide employment, but investment and development does. Now, I think there's a balance there that we need to look at, But this idea of how can we bring access to the American economy, which is still the gold standard, how do we bring that? And so one of the things we've stood up at AFRICOM is a small unit, it's very small, and there's a hand-selected group of folks to look at the convergence between economics and security. And I'm not trying to be commerce. I've got a Foreign Service commercial officer coming from Commerce this summer to be on my staff, and I've got a liaison officer from Department of Energy who specializes in critical minerals and energy to be on my staff full-time to look at this, because what we can articulate or understand is what is the security implication. But being less than 1/10 of 1%, we may not be the right tool. But there are other tools, other levers of national power that we can pull, commercial or economic or maybe diplomatic or informational, that can have that effect. And when you start looking at this, as we highlight the importance of information, as I've also elevated that into a special task force, information, economics, and then I put innovation on there, which we are still the gold standard of innovation. And you start putting those together, you start seeing a really interesting confluence where those three come together, you can have real impact. And I can have security results without having a large military presence. And if I can do that, now we're starting to be a force multiplier, and we bring something intangible that other nations can't. And we need to be able to talk about that and articulate that, but we have to perform, right? We have to deliver on that trade. We have to be able to invest. I'm not saying it's investing in all 54 countries on the continent, but we need to be able to invest in key partners, willing partners who want to work together. And I think that we can make some real gains there. And so again, it goes to the convening power. We can discuss the security implications. Maybe it's the economic lever, but how do we talk about that? And the last piece I do want to hit on that, since I got off on the tangent, is critical minerals are absolutely vital. 1/3 of the world's critical minerals are in Africa. The vast majority of the undeveloped, unexploited resources are in Africa. China dominates this market. They have 70, 80, sometimes 90% of the market. More importantly, they dominate the refining of these critical minerals. That is a strategic vulnerability. And we've seen it play out in tariff wars. We've already seen them threaten this. This is something we need to take very seriously. And it's not stockpiling mounds of lithium and cobalt if we can't refine it. But how do we look at the economic investment that allows that to be a viable investment? Because these mines and these resources are often in the central part of southern and central Africa. So it's not just investment in the mine, it's looking at what is that ecosystem that needs to be developed from the rail, the roads, the ports, and the things that make that rail line viable. So one of the companies we've been talking to is a Dutch company that wants to build, it's in the Libido corridor, wants to build grain silos. And people look at me and say, why does the US military care about grain silos? And honestly, I don't really care about it. What I care about is what does that country need to make that railroad economically viable so we can gain access to the critical minerals that build the weapons that I rely upon, whether that's a Columbia-class submarine, an F-35, or the smart weapons, the exquisite weapons that we build. It takes tons of these minerals. And if we don't have access to them, we will be at a strategic disadvantage. And it takes a decade plus to develop that chain, from extraction through refining to actual production.
General, we're going to have to leave it there.
That's no fun.
Well, I mean, we can keep going. Hour two. Brittany, can we go? No, okay. You know, obviously, given what's going on with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, some concerning developments, but also I was glad to end on the opportunity that is available there. But thank you very much for being with us, and thank you.
Yeah, can I say one last thing?
Yeah.
Sally knows this. I never know when to be quiet. But two things, actually. One is the Moroccan partners here. They have really leaned in. They have offered to deepen the relationship, and we are looking at opportunities there for investment to develop contingency basing, but more importantly, to help build out the range infrastructure there where we can do full spectrum operations and actually employ EW combined with combined arms. And looking at that investment and then looking at companies that need that range space, that are using some of these advanced weapons, that can then test them there and evaluate them, that's not too far from Europe. Another thing is using this to then move towards future technologies and looking at 6G and what that means. There's not a lot of countries on the continent that could absorb 6G right now, but if we bring 6G to the continent, 1/3 of the continent does not have access to running sewage, regular sewage, but 98% plus have access to cellular telecoms. 6G brings edge computing, it brings banking, it brings access to the global economy to that entire continent. And we can either choose to be the drivers of that, or we can watch other nations be the drivers and hope that they choose to come to our economy.
There's a lot of opportunity, private-public partnerships there to develop
Absolutely.
things in Africa.
So that was one. The last one, I'm just going to tell a short story because you were going to ask this, but you didn't. But, you know, Sally said, how many years have you served? 30 years. It's 34. People will ask me, you know, and I was just at my old ROTC unit at Washington University in St. Louis, and they ask, well, you know, why do you still serve? And I'll just go back to the time that I was an Olmsted Scholar in the Czech Republic, and I had a chance to study there for 2 years. And I didn't really fully realize the value of that experience until years later. But after being there for almost 2 years, it was about this time of year, I was coming home from the pub late at night, hanging out with some friends, went through Náměstí Svobody, which is Freedom Square, and walking up the cobblestone street to the tram stop before the last tram ran. And I walked up maybe 20, 30 meters, and maybe, I don't know, from me to the edge of the stage, I heard this voice in the middle of the night. And I stopped and looked, and there's this little old lady sitting there. And she had 2 buckets of lilacs sitting at her feet as she sat on the stoop of this store. And she had just the clearest blue eyes that literally sparkled in the night. And they caught my attention. And so I stopped and said, Pani so děláš proč tady je velmi pozdě, which is, you know, grandmother, why are you here? It's very late. You know, what are you doing? And I expected an answer. Instead, she asked me, well, you've got a strange accent. Where are you from? Are you one of those Austrians? And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm an American. And I went through a well-rehearsed spiel about studying at Maastricht University and what I was doing there. And she stopped and then really surprised me because she said in English, half 100 years ago, I studied English at that same university. And the reason that surprised me is this was not too long after the fall of the wall. Brno is the second city. My wife and I had met maybe 4 or 5 people who could hold a conversation in English in that 2-year period. And they could speak Russian or German, Czech, but not English. And so she continues and she said, half 100 years ago, when I was studying English, I dreamed of going to America. But the war came and they closed the university. After the war, when they reopened, I went back and I dreamed of going to California because I heard the Golden Gate is beautiful. But she said, then the communists came to power and they closed the English department, and I've never spoken English since. Now, in my state at the early wee hours of the morning, I was going through this thinking a couple things. One, that was a long time ago. She's clearly in her late 70s, early 80s now. And then as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, why is she thanking me? Because she's selling these lilacs for 5 crowns a bunch, which is about 2 or 3 cents at the time in the exchange rate. And right across from the tram stop was a park that was full of lilacs, and I'm pretty sure that's where she got them, and I could have had all the lilacs I wanted. And so I'm thinking, why on earth is she thanking me? Because she probably lost her subsidized medical and housing and food, and her pension probably was not doing so well. And so we continued to talk for a while, and finally, in the mix of Czech and English, I said goodnight and was getting ready to leave. And then she surprised me again when she reached up and she took my hand. And she said, thank you. Thank you for being here. I never got to go to America, and I never dreamed there'd be an American in my city. And I am so glad you're here. It still chokes me up. And Captain Anderson did not understand why on earth she was thanking me. I had a lot of fun flying around the world, drinking a lot of beer. And why was she thanking me? Because her life clearly was not better than it was a few years ago. And it took me a few weeks, maybe months, thinking about this, and I finally realized that she was not thanking Captain Anderson. She was thanking every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who stood the watch during the Cold War, that stood for values and ideals that are enshrined in this dusty old piece of paper we call the Constitution, that's embodied by the words that we saw earlier about truths that are self-evident, truths that transcend borders, that transcend cultures, and that are deeply human. And once that hit me, that's why she was thanking me, I realized I was no longer just defending our borders or the Statue of Liberty, but I was defending the words that sit at her feet. And there was a reason I put that uniform on every day. So for 34 years, I've continued to do that, even when I didn't want to always get out of bed, or I didn't enjoy the next meeting I was going to go to, or things were just feeling a little rough. I felt I owed it to people who I'd never meet, who still saw America, who still saw the United States as a beacon of hope. And hope is a powerful motivator. And I see this across Africa. Not everyone wants to leave their homeland and come to America, but they do want the opportunities. They do want the independence. They want the freedom. And these things are important. We need to defend this because this is the world's greatest experiment. And it is fragile. And I will continue to put the uniform on until they tell me I am no longer welcome to do that. And I know I don't have much runway left in front of me. It's about out. But this is why my daughter went to 9 different schools before she went to college. This is why we moved on average every 18 months. And this is why I continue to do it, and I'm happy to do it, and I'm thrilled actually that you're willing to sit here and listen to me discuss this. And one anecdote that goes with this, because it tied into some of the things folks were mentioning before, but I've only been to China once. I had a chance, I was stationed in Korea and got to go, and went to Xi'an. It was a dream of mine since I had seen the Terracotta Warriors in the National Geographic when I was about 8 years old to go see that. And so we got to go there, so we hired a guide to take us, and he spoke exceptional English. And he took a lot of pictures of my family and I for his brochures, his tourism brochures, so I'm sure my dossier in Beijing is quite thick. But he kept talking to us, and he kept comparing China and the United States. And he said, you know where Chinese students tested on the math scores? We were number 1. Do you know where the United States was? I said, nope. Where you were in the science scores? We were number 2. And then he even came out and he said, we have 54 national parks. That's more than the United States. I was like, yeah, but we invented them. And he was just wearing me out. And so finally, at one point at lunch, I turned to him and I said, you know what? There is one area that the United States is number 1 in by far. And as a matter of fact, you take the next 9 countries and you combine them, we are still number 1. I said, do you know what that is? And he said, no. I said, it's immigration. More people want to come to the United States than any other country on this planet. How many people come to China knowing that they had more people who emigrated than immigrated? I never got another comparison. But I say that because this is what motivates me and why it's important and why I appreciate the fact there are people here that share those values and want to look at how we bring those together, because it's going to take all of the levers of our national power and all of our effort in order to secure this great experiment that we still enjoy. And the last part, the punchline to the whole. And the last, I just leave you with the punchline to the story, was the next morning, my wife Liz woke me up, I think way too early that next morning, and was like, what on earth were you doing last night? And I was like, well, I was out with Yerzy and Pavel and some friends. You were clear, and we talked about this. And she said, no, why is the sink full of lilacs? And so I had given that old lady every crown that was in my wallet, and I took all the lilacs and I walked home with them because I had missed the tram by that point and didn't know what to do with them, so I filled the sink with water and put all the lilacs in there. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
More than you wanted.
All right.
Thanks.